The auction barn in Milbrook smelled like diesel, wet hay, and the particular kind of dust that settles into wooden bleachers over 60 years of livestock sales. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and Anne Whitfield had driven 45 minutes from her failing 5-acre homestead to sit in the back row with a checkbook that had exactly $340 left in it. She wasn't there for the cattle. She wasn't there for the goats being auctioned off 2 lots earlier. She was there because of a single line item on the auction sheet, tucked between farm equipment and a pallet of chick starter feed. 90 laying hens, culled flock, as is, no returns. What the sheet didn't say, but what everyone in that barn already knew, because word travels fast in farming communities, was that these 90 hens were blind, or nearly blind. They'd come from a large commercial egg operation 2 counties over that had been hit by a strain of infectious bronchitis that in a small percentage of birds causes permanent damage to the eyes. The operation didn't have the labor or the patience to sort 90 birds that couldn't reliably find their own feed troughs. Culling them was cheaper than caring for them, so they went to auction, lumped together as a single lot, priced to move fast and be forgotten. Anne raised her hand when the bidding opened at $4 a bird. Nobody bid against her. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Dwayne, who'd been running these sales since Anne was in grade school, actually paused mid-chant. "You sure, Anne? These are cull birds. Might be blind. Might not lay worth a damn." "I heard you the first time, Dwayne," she said. "Sold then?" He shrugged and brought the gavel down. $360 for 90 hens. As the crowd filed out past her, she heard the laughing before she even stood up. Not cruel laughing exactly. More the tired, knowing chuckle of people who'd farmed long enough to recognize what looked like a bad decision. "Blind hens," someone muttered. "Good luck getting eggs out of that." Another farmer, an older man in a canvas coat, patted her shoulder on the way out and said, not unkindly, "You know you can still return them if it says no returns, right? Might want to reconsider." She didn't reconsider. To understand why Anne did this, and to understand what happened over the following 14 months, you have to understand 2 things: her situation and the actual biology of what she was buying. Anne was 58 years old. She'd inherited 5 acres and a falling-down farmhouse from her mother 2 years earlier, after 30 years working as a school administrative assistant in town. The land had a small orchard, a stretch of overgrown pasture, and a chicken coop her mother had built in the 1980s that hadn't held a bird in over a decade. Her husband Gary had passed away 4 years before that, and the settlement from his life insurance had mostly gone to medical bills at the end. She wasn't destitute, but she was close to it, living on a fixed income, trying to figure out what to do with land that was eating money instead of making any. She'd read about backyard egg operations. She'd looked at the math. A dozen conventional eggs from the grocery store ran about $3. Pasture-raised, soy-free. Specialty eggs from local farms were going for $6, $7, sometimes $8 a dozen in the farmers' markets 2 towns over. She didn't have the capital to buy 90 healthy layer hens. At auction or from a hatchery, that would have run her closer to $15 or $20 a bird, easily $1,600 to $1,800 just for the birds, before feed, before fencing, before anything else. But blind hens. Nobody wanted blind hens. And Anne, sitting in that auction barn, was doing math nobody else in the room was doing. Here's the biology part. Because it matters, and because it's the actual reason this story isn't just a feel-good fluke, it's a story about understanding animals better than the people who gave up on them. Chickens rely on eyesight substantially less than most farmers assume when it comes to actual feed finding, because laying hens have been selectively bred for generations to be calm, food-motivated, and responsive to routine rather than to visual hunting behavior. That's more a trait of wild jungle fowl ancestors foraging for insects. Domestic layer breeds, especially production breeds, like the white leghorns and the commercial brown egg hybrids these particular hens were, are creatures of extreme habit. They eat on a schedule. They drink on a schedule. They lay in the same nesting boxes, in the same corners, day after day. Their world is small and repetitive by design. That's literally what large-scale egg production optimizes for. What that meant for Anne's birds was this: a hen that's lost most of her sight isn't lost in a barren commercial cage system with metal grating, and identical rows stretching in every direction. But she can absolutely function in a small, stable, sensory-rich environment where food, water, and nest boxes are in fixed locations, marked by consistent smell, sound, and texture rather than sight. Chickens have an excellent sense of touch through the nerve endings in their beaks. They respond strongly to sound, the rustle of feed hitting a metal pan, the particular creak of a coop door, and they navigate largely by memory and by following the flock. That last part was the key. Chickens are deeply social, flock-oriented animals. A blind hen in a flock of sighted or partially sighted birds isn't navigating alone. She's moving with the group, following the sound and movement of birds around her, finding the trough because 30 other hens are already there, making noise at it. Dwayne and the men laughing in the parking lot were thinking about 90 individual broken birds. Carol Ann was thinking about one functioning flock. She spent her first 2 weeks not on marketing or eggs at all, but on the coop itself. She fixed the fencing so there were no sudden holes or drop-offs. She built ramps instead of steps wherever birds needed to change levels, because a blind hen misjudging a step is a broken leg, but a ramp she can feel with her feet is safe at any speed. She laid a consistent flooring texture throughout, the same straw and sand mixture from the coop door all the way to the nesting boxes, so a bird could navigate by feel alone if she had to. She kept feeders and waterers in exactly the same spots, never rearranged, and she used metal pans that made a distinctive clank when she filled them, training the birds within days to associate that sound with feeding time. Within about 3 weeks, she noticed something that made her sit down on an overturned bucket and just watch for an hour. The hens had built their own traffic patterns. They moved through the coop and run in loose, worn paths, like sighted people find had worn footpaths into grass. The flock had essentially built its own tactile map of the property, together. Egg production started slower than a typical flock. It took closer to 5 weeks instead of the usual 2 to 3 for the birds to settle enough to lay consistently, which makes sense biologically, since laying is deeply tied to a hen's stress hormones, and these birds had just been through relocation, a new flock structure, and recovery from illness. But once they settled, the production numbers were, frankly, not that different from a healthy flock of the same breed and age. Blindness from the eye, damage these birds had, didn't affect their reproductive systems at all. It affected their vision. That was it. Carol Ann had understood something that the commercial operation, focused purely on efficiency and labor costs, hadn't bothered to consider. A chicken doesn't lay eggs with her eyes. By month 3, she had roughly 60 dozen eggs a week coming out of that coop, and this is where the second half of the story becomes just as important as the first, because raising the hens was only half the problem. Selling blind hen eggs for grocery store prices would have kept her exactly where she started, barely breaking even. She needed the $12 number, and she got there not by hiding the story, but by telling it. She started small. A folding table at the Saturday farmer's market with a hand-lettered sign. Not farm fresh eggs. Everyone's sign said that. Hers said, "Eggs from our blind hens. Ask me why they're the calmest flock in the county." People stopped because it was strange. She told them the auction story. She told them about the ramps, and the sound-trained feeding, and the tactile flooring. She was 58 years old, plain-spoken, not trying to sell anything except the truth. And it turned out the truth was more compelling than any marketing copy she could have written. There's a real phenomenon here worth naming plainly, because it's not just sentiment, it's economics. Consumers in the specialty egg market, particularly the demographic buying $7 and $8 eggs at farmers markets in the first place, are already paying a premium for a story. Pasture-raised, humane, small batch, know your farmer. Carol Ann's flock had all of that, plus something no marketing department could manufacture. A genuinely unusual, verifiable, specific narrative about an animal welfare success that most people in agriculture had written off as a lost cause. She wasn't selling eggs. She was selling proof that a supposedly worthless flock, given real thought instead of a shrug, could thrive. By the following spring, she'd raised her price twice, each time after being asked directly by customers why she wasn't charging more. She landed at $12 a dozen and sold out every single week, with a waiting list. A small restaurant in town started buying 4 dozen a week for their weekend brunch menu, and put Whitfield Farm blind hen eggs directly on the printed menu, which did more for her business than any flyer could have. A regional newspaper ran a short piece on her in February. By the one-year mark from that auction day, she'd expanded the flock by hatching some of her own replacement birds from a rooster she'd added. Though she kept the original 90, by then closer to 84, as a few had been lost to age and one to a hawk, as the anchor of the operation. The auctioneer, Dwayne, apparently drove out to see the place himself that following autumn, almost exactly a year after the sale. Carol Ann tells that part of the story simply. He stood at the fence, watched the flock moving in their worn paths toward the feed pans clanging in the evening light, and didn't say much beyond, "Well, I'll be damned." She didn't need him to say more than that. The $360 he'd taken for a lot nobody wanted had turned, within 14 months, into a business generating several $1,000s a month in egg sales alone, not counting the started pullets she began selling to other small farmers interested in trying the same approach with their own culled or vision-impaired birds, a niche she more or less created by accident. What makes this story worth telling isn't just that it has a happy ending, it's that every step of it is explainable by things that are true about chickens, true about markets, and true about what happens when someone pays closer attention than the people around them. The commercial operation that culled these birds wasn't wrong, that blind hens were inefficient for their system, a system built around thousands of birds, minimal individual attention, and workers who don't have time to build ramps or train sound cues for a small percentage of the flock. Carol Ann wasn't proving that operation wrong. She was proving that a different scale, a different kind of attention, and a willingness to design an environment around an animal's actual remaining senses could turn a liability into an asset. There's something else worth sitting with here, too. Carol Ann didn't do any of this because she had some grand vision of building a business. By her own account, she did it because she looked at those birds in the auction barn and thought about how her own mother, in her last years, had lost most of her eyesight to macular degeneration and had still moved through that same farmhouse with total confidence, because she knew where every piece of furniture was, where every step and doorframe sat, because nothing in her environment ever moved. Carol Ann built her mother's house for her flock without entirely realizing that's what she was doing until she was several months into it. Her mother had passed by the time the flock started thriving, but Carol Ann says she still talks to her out at the coop some mornings, telling her the numbers, telling her about the restaurant menu, telling her the ramps worked. The hens didn't know they were supposed to be worthless. They just knew where the feed was, because someone had finally bothered to make sure they could find it. Today, Whitfield Farm sits on the same 5 acres, still with the same coop her mother built, expanded twice now. The sign at the farmer's market still says the same thing it said that first Saturday. Eggs from the blind hens, $12 a dozen. Ask her why they're the calmest flock in the county. People still ask. She still tells them, and every week she still sells out.